This is the start of Eating Disorder Awareness Week, and on today's episode of GetPsyched, we're going to be taking a look at the 6 most important things that you need to know about eating disorders. What's up guys, welcome to another week's episode of GetPsyched. Now as I said, this is the start of Eating Disorder Awareness Week, and this is a really important week because eating disorders is something that's still really not well understood in our society. It's really not well recognized as well, but it's massively impactful in a negative sense for so many people across the world. And as a result, it's really important that we get to understand eating disorders a little bit more. So we're going to be looking at the top 6 most important things that you need to know about eating disorders here. The first thing to know, number 1, is that not all eating disorders are equal. There are different forms of eating disorders that mean different things and can look very different in different people. The first kind of eating disorder is perhaps the most commonly well known, which is anorexia nervosa, which is the pursuit of losing weight to an excessive degree. Now, so commonly within anorexia nervosa, people want to lose weight even when they're severely unhealthy. So this talks to the subjectivity of the individual who can actually have really low body weight but still think that they need to lose weight. What's also really quite terrifying about anorexia nervosa is that statistically it has the highest mortality rate of any psychiatric illness on earth. It speaks to the severity of anorexia nervosa. It speaks to the challenge in treatment, which is something we're going to look at when it comes to treating eating disorders as well. But it also talks to the massive distress and complications that people can experience as a result of anorexia nervosa. The second type of eating disorder that we're going to look at is bulimia nervosa. Now, this is also something that people are reasonably familiar with to a certain degree. Bulimia nervosa is different from anorexia because it's not necessarily the pursuit of rapid weight loss, but rather it's kind of the compensatory behaviors and actions with eating, with unhealthy patterns of eating. So for example, binging is something that often is quite common within bulimia nervosa, which can be, eating an excessive amount of food in a very short period of time to then be followed by a compensatory behavior such as starving or purging, for example. So that could be where somebody takes in a lot of food over a very short period of time and then makes themselves sick as a compensatory behavior, or even exercises excessively. That can also be a form of bulimia nervosa. One of the challenges about bulimia nervosa is it's actually very difficult to recognize in people because people with bulimia can actually hold a very healthy body weight at times. So sometimes it's very easy for people with bulimia nervosa to hide this eating disorder, to make it seem like they don't have an eating disorder even, and so it's very hard to treat. It's also very hard to identify. The third type of eating disorder we're going to look at is binge eating disorder, which is kind of probably the most common, and I suppose in some ways many of us will have experienced this to some degree, but it's about consuming a large amount of food in a very short period of time. Now, done consistently and over a long period of time, this can be diagnosed as binge eating disorder. One of the reasons that this is so complicated and so distressing is that it results in a lot of emotional distress for people that are involved in it, or people that partake in binge eating disorder, where there's a lot of shame and guilt that can be attributed. So emotional distress is a big factor when it comes to binge eating disorder. Okay, our second point of things to understand about eating disorders is that eating disorders do not discriminate. One of the things that's really commonly misunderstood about eating disorders is it's a psychiatric illness that only affects women, or even only affects young people to some degree. What we're starting to see in the current research and in the literature is that increasingly a large number of men are starting to exhibit things such as binge eating disorder, bulimia nervosa, and even anorexia nervosa. So what was commonly deemed as a psychiatric illness, eating disorders as a psychiatric illness for women, more often is becoming a male thing as well. There was a recent study that found that 2% of all men will experience some form of eating disorder at some point in their life, and that statistic is actually increasing year upon year. What's also really difficult about this is that in the current climate of gaining muscle or gaining size amongst the male population, forms of eating disorders are becoming more common. Now, one of the ways, we're going to talk a little bit about this later, but one of the ways in which we recognize eating disorders is a really unhealthy body image, self-body image. And that's something that's becoming more commonplace in the male population, that's then leading to subsequent eating disorders, such as binge eating disorder, for example, which is becoming more common within the male population in order to attain a certain male physique. So it's really important to recognize that eating disorders don't discriminate, and men do suffer from this at an increasing rate in today's society. The third thing that we need to understand about eating disorders is starting to understand the signs of eating disorders. Now, the thing to keep in mind with this is I want to put a little bit of a disclaimer in here, because I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the signs of eating disorders. Now, if you experience one of these signs, which probably we all will have had, we will all probably connect to one or two of these signs, doesn't necessarily mean that you have an eating disorder. It's really important to take these signs collectively and then consult your GP as well if you think that you might be at risk of having an eating disorder. The other thing to keep in mind as well is that it's not always easy to identify. People that have eating disorders become very, very good at hiding it. And often we talk about in therapy as well, of recognizing people with eating disorders when sometimes their clothing changes in order to hide the changes in their body. That's primarily associated to maybe binge eating disorder or anorexia nervosa. But also in bulimia nervosa, people hiding them vomiting after they eat and not telling people. It can be a very secretive psychiatric illness. That makes it very hard to identify. One of the key identifying features of somebody with an eating disorder, as we've already kind of said, is a distorted or a rapidly changing self-body image. Now, if somebody starts to say that, they're so overweight, or starts to make comment about changes in their body, or identifying like a dislike of their body, I suppose to some degree we all experience that, but if that's done to a really severe extent and consistently, then we can start to see that that's probably an early sign of an eating disorder. The other thing to keep in mind when identifying eating disorders is behaviors that are compensatory to food. So, for example, when somebody is eating, if they either are making themselves sick, we can obviously identify that as bulimia nervosa, but also if they over-exercise. So if somebody is consuming a large amount of food, or just a normal amount of food actually, and then going off and excessively exercising, then we can start to see that maybe is the beginnings of a sign of what could be an eating disorder. Things also like rapid weight loss or odd behaviors around eating, these are things that are also key signs of potential eating disorders. And what I mean by odd behaviors around eating is that sometimes with eating disorders, when people do eat, they can have very strange rituals, what appear to be very strange rituals around their eating. So maybe the lights have to be a certain way, their plate has to be facing a certain way, things have to be in a certain order. If we see some more of these kind of compulsive behaviors around eating, then we could start to argue that that's maybe a sign of what could be an eating disorder. The fourth thing that we need to understand better about eating disorders, and this one is a really important one for me, it's not about looking better. Often what happens in eating disorders is that people out with the individual who has the eating disorder thinks that person is trying to look better, is trying to look a certain way, is trying to be more attractive in some senses. And often that's not what this is. So often, and I'm speaking very objectively, it's different for different people, but through my experience and my understanding is that so often this is about control. When people lack a certain amount of control in their life, then they obtain control where they can. And for some people, that control can come in the form of managing their food intake or really rapidly changing their food intake and seeing physiological results, having an impact, having control in some way in their lives. It can also be a form of self-punishment. That's also very common within eating disorders, is that this isn't about trying to lose weight, to look better, to be skinnier, to look a certain way, what they deem as looking better. That's not what this is. Sometimes it can be a form of self-punishment. The fifth thing that we're going to look at with regards to eating disorders is that it's not a choice. Now, often eating disorders can start as a very basic, simple choice, maybe to reduce calories or to exercise more or in order to fit into a new pair of jeans or something to that effect. But often eating disorders, given the right context and the right environment and variables, can rapidly descend into an eating disorder. And once that happens, it no longer becomes about choice. It's like saying to somebody that they're choosing to be depressed or anxious. That of course sounds ridiculous to us. It's the same with eating disorders. This isn't a choice. This is a perpetual cycle that sometimes people can get really stuck in. And in fact, research has actually correlated the progressive decline of eating disorders to trauma. That in some ways, what we experience in a trauma, what people experience in a trauma that then has physiological results or psychological implications later down the road is very similar to what people go through when they have an eating disorder. That speaks to the fact that eating disorders aren't choices. This isn't something that somebody is actually even wanting to do sometimes. It's something that they're compelled to do, that they're impacted to do. Now the last thing, the sixth point that we're going to look at of the important things to know about eating disorders is that treatment is possible. Now it doesn't mean that it's easy, and in fact treatment for eating disorders can be incredibly complex, because accessing treatment, sometimes it's not off the individual's accord. They've not necessarily got an eating disorder and then thought, gosh, I need to go to therapy, or I need to go to a rehab clinic, or I need on medication. It's often external forces that say to them, maybe that's parents or family or friends, that say to them they need help. And that can make it very difficult for people to really engage with treatment. What also is difficult and complex about treatment is that in order for the person to get better, they have to do the one thing that they try to avoid for so long, which is gain weight. According to ANRED, which is an anorexia nervosa support charity, over 30% of people with an eating disorder drop out of treatment in the first few sessions. So that speaks to the massive dropout rate that we experience with eating disorders, particularly with anorexia nervosa and bulimia, to be fair. There's a massive dropout rate because it can be incredibly challenging for these people to confront the issue that they're facing and also feel that they have to do something about it. And actually doing something about it in the initial stages in particular doesn't feel better. It doesn't feel like the right thing. However, a recent study from the Massachusetts General Hospital found that if people stick to therapy over the long term, there can be as high a success rate as over 2/3. So treatment, albeit can be difficult, and particularly in the initial stages for people with eating disorders, but therapy for treating eating disorders can be incredibly effective over the long term. There's been more and more studies done about what kinds of psychotherapies can be helpful, particularly cognitive behavioral therapy, when it looks at distorted thinking patterns or other kinds of thinking patterns towards food and weight can be helpful. But there's been more research recently about family therapy as well, and how actually families can be a really helpful support network for people who have anorexia or who have bulimia or have any kind of eating disorder in order to help them overcome that. Family therapy can be a really good option. Okay guys, thank you so much for watching this week's episode of GetPsyched. This week we've been taking a look at the 6 most important things that we need to know about eating disorders in order to be more aware of Eating Disorder Awareness Week this week. I hope you guys have found this helpful, informative. If you have, then make sure to like the video. You can comment on our video as well and I'll be sure to get back to you. And if you've been enjoying GetPsyched as a whole, then make sure to subscribe to us, and you can hit that little bell next to the subscribe button and get weekly reminders every time we upload. Thanks again for watching guys, and hopefully catch you next week.